Before the story begins, if you find this kind of careful, unsettling history valuable, stay with it to the end. Subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you don't miss the full account and the lessons we draw from it. Rome, 37 AD. Beneath the carved eaves of the Palatine, and under a sky made pale by oil lamps, a force that had conquered provinces and paraded as the living hand of empire moved like a tide through the city. Banners, short swords, the measured tread of disciplined feet. It was an army both real and symbolic, legions that had carried Rome's weight across the world, and the imperial guard whose presence reshaped politics, law, and honor. What followed was not merely the fall of a ruler, but the slow vanishing of a certain kind of Roman military sovereignty, an instrument of conquest turned instrument of spectacle, and finally, of erasure. Ancient chroniclers record the events in jagged fragments. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio offer versions that overlap and contradict, and modern historians still debate motive and measure. This is the story of that army, of how it helped make an emperor, how it was reshaped by him, and how its authority, for a time, burned so bright it consumed itself. The young man who would become the center of this drama arrived at power in a city still raw from Tiberius's late winter of repression. The Julio-Claudian line had been bred in murder and cautious calculation. Names like Germanicus and Agrippina carried not just ancestry, but reputations for charisma and tragedy. Gaius, nicknamed in childhood by the soldiers of the Rhine as Caligula for the miniature boots he wore among them, carried with him an intimacy with soldiery that others of his rank lacked. He had been watched and schooled by legions. That familiarity, when married to imperial authority, is a combustible thing. Soldiers had crowns in their hands, and the city averted its eyes. When Tiberius died, the corridors of power moved fast. Praetorian loyalties were decisive. The imperial guard, those who answered directly to the person of the princeps rather than to the Senate, had been instrumental under Tiberius in enforcing will and settling succession. Their commanders negotiated access. Their cohorts policed the forum. A Praetorian voice could be the difference between a triumphant procession and a funeral. In the months that followed the accession, Caligula's first acts played to that instrument. He paraded generosity, rewarded soldiers, distributed largesse with the ostentation Rome had long equated with legitimate power. For a city newly relieved of fear, the spectacle of an emperor handing out coins, games, and titles felt like deliverance. The guard that had once been the Praetorian shadow of state coercion now became an organ of public celebration. This early phase mattered. It established a contract. The army that had conquered everything in the sense of military victory and political sway expected certain reciprocities. Tribute, respect, triumph. Caligula, in those months, offered them performances of reward and the theatrical affirmation they craved. But the terms of the contract began to mutate as his health, according to several ancient sources, changed. A severe illness within a year laid him low. After his recovery, contemporaneous reported a marked change in temperament and appetite for spectacle. Later writers paint this as the hinge on which the man's rule changed direction. How much of that diagnosis is history and how much rhetorical staging is uncertain. Ancient chroniclers had motives and literary styles that could magnify grotesque detail for moral effect. Still, the transformation of the relationship between emperor and army is less contested than the diagnosis. The guard's role broadened from protector and arbiter to enabler and instrument of the emperor's private whims. The transformation revealed itself in small humiliations and then in ritualized public gestures. Where once banners and trumpets marked campaigns against foreign kings and cities, they began to mark the emperor's processions into tableaus. Soldiers were ordered into pageants that blurred military discipline and court theater. Some accounts, reported by later narrators and debated by modern scholars, describe parades staged in which battalions simulated victories or served as living props to advertise the emperor's imagination of himself. These acts did not by themselves erode military virtue. What mattered was intent. The legions that had learned to take orders for the sake of survival and empire now received orders aimed at spectacle, at self-deification, at humiliation of civic authorities. The guard's legitimacy, which had rested on defending the realm and maintaining order, began to shift toward defending the person and persona of one man. Politics followed the theater. The Senate, already diminished by decades of imperial consolidation, found itself further humiliated in the presence of the military pageant. Senators were mocked in amphitheaters, shorn of dignity on the very benches that once decided laws. Trials for treason swelled. Property was confiscated in tricks thinly veiled as legal proceedings, and money flowed from confiscations to the imperial household. Ancient sources tell of prosecutions launched on slender pretexts, with informers and soldiers testifying in courts that had become stages of intimidation. Again, where the record is lurid in specifics, the modern scholar urges caution. Suetonius and Cassius Dio wrote with a relish for the sensational, and Tacitus, writing later, shaped events to fit a moral arc. But the larger pattern, the use of military force to silence elite opposition and extract wealth, fits the archival fragments and makes sense in the logic of concentrated power. The picturesque and the brutal often met in the same acts.
A santa e o brutal often met in the same acts.
Much my spinning in turn when an emperor leverages soldiers to silence opposition. The guard becomes both arbiter and enforcer, and internal factions form along the fault lines of conscience and ambition. Some commanders, whose careers had prospered under the new order, sought to protect their gains. Others, who had watched reputations and tradition burned, longed for restitution. Dramatizations of moments inside the Palatine, reconstructions based on the texture of surviving accounts, suggest terse exchanges that reveal this fracture. A young tribune, his tunic stained with torch smoke, might be imagined saying, in a night of whispered anger, "We were sworn to hold the gates of Rome, not the vanity of a single man." An older centurion could reply, counting coins he had received, "Yet the coin feeds my men. What is honor to a hungry legion?" Such fragments are reconstruction, not documentary report. They serve to illuminate the ambivalence within the ranks. Modern scholars caution against treating them as literal transcripts. But in any plausible interior, this moral arithmetic, honor versus survival, oath versus reward, is the hidden ledger that explains how loyalty could be bought and why some would later reverse it. The emperor's personal excesses pushed the guard from symbolic co-ruler to instrument of fear. Reports, again filtered through sources with agendas, describe episodes in which soldiers acted not to repel enemies, but to terrorize civic bodies, escorting show trials, breaking into private houses to seize accused property, and enforcing humiliations in the public square. These acts, whether exaggerated or real, altered public perception. Where soldiers had been the face of Rome's stability, they now seemed the face of arbitrary power. In provinces, legionaries felt the ripple. Governors who had once relied on local prestige to administer justice found appeals to the emperor's guard more decisive. The military's long arm had extended into spaces once governed by law. A further corruption of means was the rewriting of sacred rituals to serve imperial ends. Sacrifice and religious observance, foundational to civic cohesion, were sometimes folded into personal cultic displays. Ancient witnesses report that the emperor offered himself a sort of living divinity in ways that required military affirmation. The guard, in turn, became a troupe of ritual attendants. Whether these acts were sincere religious claim or political theater matters less. They consecrated the emperor's personal claim with the imprimatur of arms. Soldiers who had once prayed with citizens at temples now stood between altars and the people, a buffer force that redefined both religious and civic access. Then came the night when private grievance crystallized into lethal action. The assassination was not an avalanche, but a carefully choreographed act by conspirators who understood the anatomy of the Palatine and the rhythms of the guard.
Cassius Dio, a tribune whose name appears in the Chroniclers, and others conspired with figures inside the court and among the senatorial class. Their motive, scholars argue, was a mixture: personal affronts, protection of senatorial dignity, and a belief that removing one man might restore damaged institutions. The attack unfolded in the palace corridors, among columns and frescoes that had witnessed both triumph and humiliation. Contemporary accounts, with their varying emphases, agree on the essential choreography. The emperor was set upon in a confined space, struck down by multiple assailants, and collapsed amid the detritus of imperial life. The scene itself resists lurid detail in sober retelling. It was swift, precise, and final. The man whose relationship with arms had defined and then distorted Roman military authority died on the threshold between private apartment and public function, where the soldier's body meets the civil arena. The immediate aftermath was confusion: soldiers loyal to the palace, officers uncertain, courtiers scattering. Word moved through the city like a thrown stone. The army that had been the engine of spectacle suddenly found itself the subject of scrutiny. Which cohorts had been complicit? Which would now enforce order? In the hours that followed, power redistributed with frantic speed. The guard that had once been indispensable to a single man's will became the mechanism for his removal. Yet disappearance is a slower phenomenon than a single night's violence. The army did not vanish in the literal sense. Legions remained stationed, cohorts marched, standards flew. What disappeared for a while was a certain kind of unchallenged primacy, the idea that the imperial guard could be the unexamined arbiter of political life. The murder exposed fault lines. Officers were implicated, reputations ruined, and the Senate saw in the violence both danger and opportunity. Claudius's accession within days of the assassination, aided by the guard in surprising fashion, reorganized the theater of power. The Praetorian Guard, which had been central to making and unmaking emperors, now presented itself as kingmaker. Yet the spectacle of its influence had been tarnished by the very excesses it had enabled. The public image of invincibility flickered. In the months and years that followed, maneuvers of memory took shape. Damnatio memoria, the official erasure of a ruler's image from public monuments and records, attempted to carve the man from history. Statues were pulled, inscriptions chiseled away. The army's role in the spectacle could not be fully erased, but parts of it were hidden, rationalized, or reshaped. Administratively, some reforms sought to recalibrate the balance between military prerogative and senatorial authority. In practice, the tension remained.
It conquers everything, and, if misapplied, disappears from the moral map that sustains states. The narrative continues. The succeeding years, the administrative recalibrations, and the broader institutional shifts that followed deserve scrutiny. The story of how Rome tried to reconstitute the relationship between arms and authority after such a rupture is as instructive as the drama of the fall itself. For now, the image of that night lingers. Soldiers in torchlight, an emperor felled, and an army's reputation altered forever. The aftermath moves us toward the next act, the consolidation under Claudius, the legal and fiscal reparations, the ways units were disciplined or rewarded, and the long memory politics of damnatio memoriae. Those reckonings will show whether an empire's institutions could mend what spectacle and unchecked personal power had torn. Claudius's accession was, in form, a restoration. In substance, it was a recalibration. He took the throne amid grief and suspicion, and he governed with a mixture of legalism, bureaucratic expansion, and theatrical humility that masked an unmistakable will to reforge the bonds between center and periphery. Where spectacle had been the tool of the deposed ruler, Claudius leaned on process and on the slow arithmetic of institutions. He understood that to repair what had been hollowed, trust, custom, the sense that law, not whim, ordered public life, would require a combination of spectacle and sober administration, public rituals to reassure, and everyday mechanisms to bind the state's gears. One of his first tasks was to placate the Senate without surrendering the imperial prerogative that had, in practice, proved necessary. Claudius made gestures, restoring some honors to the senatorial order, reviving procedures in the curia that signaled respect for senatorial dignity. But he simultaneously expanded the imperial administration in ways that shifted real authority toward the court. Freedmen and equestrian procurators, many of whom had little interest in the republican theater of the Senate, were empowered to run financial and judicial functions with grudging competence. This was not merely patronage, it was an administrative reorientation that redistributed power into offices that were directly accountable to the princeps. In doing so, Claudius both undercut the Senate's monopoly on governance and created a web of officials who could impose continuity where personal loyalty had once been the sine qua non. Fiscal repair followed political stabilization. The turmoil had left pockets of confiscation, uncertain property titles, and soldiers' claims against localities. Claudius's approach combined legal adjudication with administrative consolidation. Courts were convened to settle disputed estates and to regularize the grants of land and pension owed to veterans. The fisc, already a distinct repository of imperial funds, was reorganized to ensure predictable flows for pay and public works. Claudius's freedmen, notably those charged with the fiscus, streamlined revenue collection, and attempted to close the channels of private exaction that had burgeoned under the previous administration. The measure was less about lowering taxation than about clarifying who had the lawful right to collect and to whom the revenues now belonged. Discipline within the armed forces became both a symbol and a practical priority. The legions whose loyalty had been exploited and whose prestige had been turned into a political instrument were subject to review. Some commanders suspected of profiting from their proximity to imperial spectacle were reassigned, others retired, and a handful were cashiered after tribunals. At the same time, Claudius moved units strategically. Garrisons too near the capital were rotated. Vexallationes redistributed to provinces with pressing border work, and praetorian strengths were adjusted. The reconfiguration aimed to decouple military capacity from the immediate theater of court politics without hollowing out frontier defense. It was a delicate balance. Too many defensive deployments near the Rhine or the Euphrates, and Rome's center would appear defenseless. Too many troops in Italy risked a repeat of the previous perversion. Claudius's solution was administrative diffusion. Command was professionalized, and juridical mechanisms to try offenders and to audit accounts were quietly but persistently reinforced. The politics of memory, the damnatatio memoria, was another instrument Claudius inherited and repurposed. Where the prior emperor's image had been ubiquitous, now erasure and recontextualization began. Statues toppled, inscriptions defaced, and honors struck were not only punitive gestures. They were statements about what counted as legitimate rule. But the practice revealed its own limits. Erasing names erased records, but not events. The blank pedestals left traces that invited interpretation. In some quarters, the removal of monuments fostered cynicism. If memory is mutable at the stroke of an edict, what of truth? Claudius sought to fill those spaces with inscriptions that celebrated provincial loyalty and legal rectitude. Monuments that memorialized judicial acts, grain distributions, and public works, rather than personal divinity. The new rhetoric emphasized service and restoration, a deliberate contrast to the extravagant cultic language that had been deployed before. Provincial policy offers a compelling case study in Claudius's method. The provinces had borne the brunt of the recent instability. Xenophobic reprisals, shaken tax rolls, and local elites unsure where their loyalties ought to lie made governance tenuous. Claudius engaged in a program both carrot and stick. In regions where elites showed willingness to reaffirm Rome's order, he extended Roman legal forms and municipal privileges. Citizenship grants, elevated municipal status, and formal recognition of local magistracies. The same apparatus, the enforced property rules, could be turned to extract tribute. The same legal channels that protected citizens could, if cadre and precedent shifted, be used to marginalize opponents. Claudius's administration, therefore, instituted, unevenly and imperfectly, checks, audits of procurators, occasional substitutions of provincial governors, and public displays of accountability. The spectacle of trials, carefully staged to demonstrate rule-bound justice, became a prophylactic against the return of unchecked personal theater. In the longue durée, the Roman state came to see governance as an ensemble of procedures, appointments, audits, edicts, adjudications that conferred legitimacy by being routine, by being repeatable, and by being visible in their predictability. The consequences of this reorientation unfolded slowly. Over subsequent decades, the visible penetration of legal machinery, the proliferation of a salaried imperial bureaucracy,
And the steady redistribution of military command toward the frontiers changed how emperors exercised power. The legions, once the proximate decision-makers within the city, increasingly became instruments of border defense and imperial projection far from Rome's gates. Recruitment patterns shifted. More men from the provinces entered service, and veteran settlement became a mechanism of Romanization. Where once the city had been the primary stage for soldiers' political posturing, they now enacted their authority along the Rhine, Danube, Euphrates, and North African littorals. That redeployment diminished their immediate capacity to foment palace revolts while enhancing the empire's defensive depth. Still, the temptation of spectacle did not disappear. Later emperors would resurrect the language of divinity and personal glory when it suited them, and the apparatus of centralization could be redirected towards self-aggrandizement. The memory of Claudius's reforms, therefore, occupies a complex place in Rome's political memory. They are at once a repair job and a blueprint for governance that could be turned to different ends. For contemporaries, the relief after civil spectacle was palpable. For historians, the deeper lesson is structural. Institutions can be mended, but their mendings change the shape of power. Archaeology confirms the realities behind the rhetoric. The physical city bears the palimpsest of these decades. New administrative buildings juxtaposed with stripped pedestals. Repaired roads that lead outward toward garrison towns. Grain storage whose inscriptions record imperial grants and municipal obligations. Epigraphic evidence of citizenship grants and municipal charters attest to the slow work of integration that complemented legal and fiscal centralization. Coins, too, tell a story. Legends that emphasize restoration, the well-being of the people, and the stability of the arrangements that the state sought to make durable.
Where a city's populace had once measured an emperor by the brilliance of his pageant, the provincials learned to measure him by the punctuality of grain, the fairness of a magistrate's ruling, the repair of a bridge that cut the distance to market by a day. This was not merely administrative housekeeping. It was politics dressed as technique. The extension of legal recourse, courts that could be appealed to the emperor, statutes that explained municipal responsibilities, record-keeping that fixed obligations on stone, translated into a language ordinary men and women could understand. Citizenship, once an exotic status conferred through patronage or the sword, began to breed its own expectations. When a municipal scheme guaranteed access to magistracy for local elites or protected a curial family from abusive taxation, it knitted those elite interests to the imperial center. The bargain was pragmatic. Accept the emperor's representative and receive in exchange the predictability of law and the muscle of the empire when disputes threatened commerce or life. The army itself became a partner in this reimagined compact. Redeployments away from the capital were not only defensive gestures. They created nodes of imperial presence across far-flung landscapes. Garrison towns matured into markets and administrative hubs. Veterans settled on plots whose titles were stamped by Rome. The legionary road network opened hinterlands to taxation and to petition. Where once a strong man could menace the city with a parade of standards, now legions anchored their authority in provincial order, levying grain in a predictable season, policing banditry, escorting magistrates. The soldier's loyalty was recalibrated toward a wage, a discharge settlement, and a juridical settlement that framed his rights and obligations,
practical bonds that outlasted the rhetorical loyalty paid to a single figure. Yet law and administration are porous to ambition. As the machinery of governance refined itself, it also created professionals whose discretion could be decisive. Jurists and procurators, senators and equestrian procurators, freedmen of the imperial household. These were not mere functionaries. They accumulated knowledge and influence. Their records, opinions, and precedents shaped how statutes were implemented. In some hands, the apparatus became a shield against arbitrariness. In others, it became an instrument of preference. The scholarly discipline of jurisprudence grew, and with it an orthodoxy of procedure that sometimes outpaced the moral imagination of those who governed. Thus, the system's very strength, its routinization, could also give rise to new forms of exclusion and to an insidious professionalism that privileged interpretation over equity. Civic ritual adapted to this new balance.
O civic ritual adapted to this new balance. Oficiais que antes entendiam a autoridade, constrangeu-os, e os soldados do império mapearam seus caminhos em estatutos, em cartas municipais. Os conceitos corporativos, os interesses privados, aumentaram sua influência e direcionaram novamente a política. A história não se sustentou em uma única moral. O império, sob a influência de seus imperadores, abriu seus caminhos para a ambição, que não frearam, mas em defesa do governo, a mastery das armas, a busca da governança. Antes da conflagração do Palatino, alegado é a busca pragmática. Para a permanência, a arte de governança.